GM, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the roll up, and today's episode is about chain signatures. This is a fascinating new primitive. It just went live on Near mainnet, and today we're chatting with Kendall Cole, who is leading the charge in designing these chain signatures. They enable omni-chain use cases for DeFi. They also open up use cases for atomic transactions that originate on, say, Bitcoin or Ethereum or Dogecoin. They do interact with the Near blockchain, but the user never has to know that they have anything to do with Near. They continue using their native asset on their native chain. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. It really is a very cool new primitive. Before we get into it, a word from our sponsors. Sit back, enjoy the show.
Mantle is a layer 2 blockchain with one of the biggest on-chain treasuries in all of crypto, and they have a 100-day campaign called Metamorphosis live now. What this is it is a campaign for their liquid staked ETH token, METH, as well as their upcoming liquid restaking token, CMETH, where you can utilize this token on the Mantle network in a variety of different apps, some of your favorite restaking protocols and DeFi protocols, and earn yields in the form of powder, which will eventually be turning into a governance token. Mantle's been around for a while. We like them because they use their own form of EigenDA. They have a good ecosystem and they're growing. So check out this 100-day Metamorphosis campaign and hope you guys enjoy the rest of this video.
What is going on, guys? Welcome to the roll up. We have another episode today with Kendall. Kendall is working on proximity. And we're going to be digging into that with all of its chain abstraction ties. Another entity out of the Near Foundation. I think we'll get into a little bit about Kendall's background and the progress out of that. And yeah, Kendall, without further ado, I'll let you kind of introduce yourself and introduce proximity.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Robbie. Excited to jam. So my name is Kendall. I'm a co-founder of a company called Proximity. So we were set up by some early Near core team contributors about 3 years ago, originally to focus on building out the DeFi ecosystem for Near. And for the last 8 months or so, we've been really focused on the go-to-market and kind of product evolution for our chain abstraction initiatives. So excited to talk about, in particular, our product called Chain Signatures today. And yeah, kind of dive into that.
Awesome, man. Well, yeah, I mean, Near did take like a really honed in perspective to chain abstraction. And so you guys are playing a big piece of that. I'm curious from your perspective, actually just to kind of set the scene here. I was at Polygon's aggregation day in Brussels, and I heard Jordy kind of lay out this mental model that he has for how he's thinking about chain abstraction. And I've kind of adopted it because I think it's pretty accurate, at least how I think about things. And I'm curious how you think about things too. So basically we have, we were talking about the difference of async and synchronous interop, and then also in the context of aggregation. And he basically laid out this mental model where at the base level, we have all of these async interoperability features and messaging at different latencies, basically, trying to figure out if we can lock state a lot of async mechanisms to make things work cross-chain. And then on top of that, we have these aggregation shelling points, if you will, that kind of sync everything up. And we have synchronous interop on top of asynchronous. And then chain abstraction is this idea that kind of once we have this aggregated perspective of the world, we kind of abstract away that for the end user. And then the end user just has a one chain view of the world. And when they're interacting with the chain, it kind of just looks abstracted away. They don't really realize maybe all of the different blockchains that they're interacting with, unless they choose to opt into some deeper insights. They kind of have a one view, one chain end user perspective of how they're interacting with the chain. So I'm curious at a high level, what is your mental model? If you kind of agree or disagree with that mental model, I'm curious about your mental model. And then we'll get into, how some of this works. Especially with regards to chain signatures, which you guys are pioneering.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that mental model is useful. I think the only thing I would maybe add or sort of change is that rather than kind of breaking things down in terms of asynchronous kind of communication and synchronous communication, the main thing we think about is atomicity. I think the most important interaction you have to try to preserve especially when abstracting the chain or dealing with multiple chains is like an atomic user action or developer action, right? It's like, okay, I want to, especially like a swap is the easiest thing, right? It's like, I want to swap USDC on Ethereum for Solana on Sol. You basically, you're going to have to send the USDC somewhere and you're going to have to receive the Solana tokens. And you're dealing with two different blockchains who have like very different environments, a lot of assumptions, a lot of different like, rollback conditions, whatever. And so like the most important thing that's preserved is the fact that if that USDC is sent somewhere from one user, that same user has to receive Solana on the other side. And if for whatever reason one of those parts fails, then like the whole thing needs to roll back. And so I think that's like our whole goal when it comes to a lot of like the things we're designing is making sure that actions are able to be atomic and able to be kind of reversed. So that's like the one technical thing I would sort of add in there in the mental model. Generally, the way we approach it, I would say, is starting more from like the user or the developer perspective for chain abstraction. I think, like you said, the idea of the user to the user, it doesn't really matter. Well, or rather like the chain they're interacting with is like merely a piece of the information of the interaction. It either might be relevant, it might not be relevant. If it is relevant, then it should be relevant only to like, okay, I'm acquiring or interacting with this particular thing on this chain, and that's relevant because it only exists on this chain, or like I want to use a specific version of Aave. It's like the context is very like dependent on what it is the user's doing. So I kind of see chain abstraction as like you may not even need to know a chain's being used at all, but you might. If you do know a chain's being used at all, then like the experience should be as fluid and seamless between chains as possible or as practical. And that's kind of like a good way to think about chain abstraction on the user side. And then the developer side, it's basically if I want to create an application that spans multiple chains and is like purely cross-chain, I can do that with as simple and like consistent APIs as possible. And maybe even more importantly is if I want, I can actually design my protocol in a chain agnostic way, where I can build like a DeFi product that can actually interact with any asset on any chain that either exists today or might exist in the future with minimal changes, or at least like a pretty like low weight kind of consistent aggregation, like integration sort of stack. So that's kind of how we approach it.
Awesome. And with atomicity, I think that's a perfect like use case or kind of like North Star that a lot of these interoperability projects are trying to enable. A lot of the DeFi applications are trying to harness and get access to this atomicity so that they can provide that multi-chain experience that is simply fluid and seamless. So I'm curious, let's kind of get into it. You guys are approaching this from chain signatures. First off, what are chain signatures? And then we'll let that lead into how that helps to enable atomicity.
Yeah, absolutely. So the simplest way to think of it is chain signatures enable smart contracts to sign transactions, which basically means that a smart contract now has public key or a set of public keys. The way that we enable that is through a decentralized MPC network. So basically what we're doing, and it's going to be a process, but we're setting up a network of MPC operators that are unrelated entities. Eventually will actually be kind of like it'll be permissionless to join the network, and it'll be permissionless to leave the network. And this network of MPC operators, they basically hold a shard of a bunch of of a key. They have like a shard of sort of a master public key. And then they basically listen to initially near smart contracts, and they listen to requests to sign a given payload. When they get that payload, they take in that payload, they take in a key derivation path that's also passed in as part of kind of like the contract call to sign the transaction. And then they construct a unique key, using that account, that smart contract that they're signing for, plus the derivation path. And then they take that unique key that only this kind of account or smart contract can sign for, and they sign that payload and return that back on chain. So effectively what that leads to is like this near account or smart contract can sign any sort of payload, any sort of transaction for any chain, even using different signature schemes. So we're launching at ECDSA, but we'll soon add support for EDDSA to cover pretty much every blockchain out there. And they're able to do that in kind of a unique way that only their sort of contracts can do it in.
Okay. Very cool. And so I can kind of start to see the pieces forming as to like how this will enable some atomic composability. Before we get there, I do have some questions about like kind of the nature of this like public key cryptography system and how we can like securely, safely sign these transactions without really a human interaction being a part of that. So my small brain, like normal perspective on this is normally like, I have a private key. I understand that my private key is essentially my seed phrase. It's like this series of words that translates to a private key. And and then I can use this as like the key to unlock my wallet and then sign a transaction. My public key is then you kind of responsible for this transaction. It's publicly available on the blockchain in the form of my wallet address. So I can kind of use my private key to initiate transactions from my public key. Now, you mentioned that like the nodes in this network, and essentially these smart contracts, like when a smart contract is on the blockchain now, it has a public address. We can see it on the blockchain. We can see the ins and the outs from this address, this public key. And I'm using address and public key pretty much interchangeably here.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's the private key part that I'm like, that I want to double click on. You know, normally my understanding is that these smart contract addresses don't have a private key because they're not signing transactions. So how are we able to construct, you mentioned it's like through this derivation path. I'm curious, like what is kind of like the workflow of this derivation path to be created? And when we do create this, is this pretty much creating a private key for these smart contracts? Maybe you can kind of demystify like this process of actually signing, how this smart contract goes about signing a transaction.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first step is basically you organize the group of, okay, like this is going to be the group of the MPC operators. This will be done through a pretty decentralized process that we'll reveal a bit later. Initially, it's going to launch in kind of a proof of authority mode. So let's say you start with like 15 of these operators. Like what they do is they basically run a process to construct a master public key out of a key shard that they each hold. So together, if basically a critical mass of them, like let's say 2/3 of them, agree to sign something with their key shard using this, we use this type of MPC cryptography called kite-sit. So using that kite-sit protocol, they can basically construct a valid signature given like a piece of data that they want to sign, and use signing with their key shard and then passing that around a couple of times. They construct the signature for this, this like master public key.
And so you don't need all of the nodes in this network to sign. You just need 2/3 of them.
Yeah, and that's like it's actually configurable as to like what the threshold is. But generally you want it to be a majority, but you want to have some room in case nodes are offline or unable to sign or, malicious. So it's, 2/3 is usually what we see teams doing this settle on.
Okay. And so I guess this is still a bit different from like a private key where I have the entire private key. I use that to sign a transaction. Are these the nodes in this network? I guess what is the difference between these key shards and a traditional public private key?
Yeah, the biggest difference is that each key shard alone is kind of useless, but key shards sort of together without having to share the key shard. So you basically like I signed a message or like I signed something using my key shard. You signed something using your key shard. We don't know that key shard is like I don't know your key shard. You don't know mine. But we can combine, like if we made it a 2 of 3, it's like us two and say Andy, if he was here, and we're 2 of 3, and like you and I sign with our key shard. Even if he doesn't, we can basically combine those messages using this function to come up with like a valid signature for the sort of key that we basically split between the 3 of us when we first did this setup process. But I have no idea what yours is. You don't know what mine is. Neither of us know what Andy's is. And so that's what's cool here is that like in order to compromise the system, you actually have to go and compromise like each of these individual groups and get to that threshold. And so the less related these parties are, and the less like the more difficult, or the like, there's a lot of factors that go into like how you sort of prevent collusion and things like that we can get into. But that's how the system works.
Awesome. Okay. And I think that makes sense from like the MPC multi-party computation, combining these keys without each party kind of like knowing who the other one is or needing to know the key itself. And so, once these nodes in the network come together, they decide, okay, we want to sign this transaction. Maybe that has some manual intervention or it's done totally automatically. How does these smart contracts that can sign transaction, how does that help to enable atomicity?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first, just so we complete the kind of cycle of how this works. So let's say we've set up the network, we have these 15 operators who have created this master public key. So what they then do is they listen to a special smart contract on the Near network that we will even turn into kind of a native transaction type that's basically requesting a signature. So a smart contract, like every smart contract on Near is also a Near account. There's like not really much differentiation. It's basically like a Near account can either have a smart contract on it or not. That's kind of what determines whether it is an account, a contract or not. So this Near account requests, like calls this function, which it does involve. If it's a smart contract, it doesn't have to be signed by its own private key. But if it's from a Near account, like a end user account, it will be. So this function is called, passes in that sort of payload to be signed. They also pass in that derivation path. And then what the MPC network does is first it sees that signature request has come in. And then it basically runs two derivation functions. First, it takes the Near account and runs a derivation function using the master public key to come up with like a new public key that only this account can sign for. Then if the user does pass in that derivation path, it'll then like basically manipulate this public key to come up with like another new public key. And the reason for that derivation path is this allows a user or a contract to basically manage any number of accounts on any number of different blockchains, right? So we have smart contracts that want to have millions of accounts that they're sort of managing. And so they need this derivation path. But so basically, like, yeah, these two derivation functions are run. Now the MPC operator network's like, okay, this is the public key we're going to use to sign this payload that we're given, which, like, let's say it's a transaction on Bitcoin. So they'll then use that public key, sign that payload, and then they basically pass back to the Near blockchain this like valid signed transaction that can then be used by the user or the smart contract to actually send a transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain that's valid. And so basically the outcome of all of this is it means that a smart contract now is able to custody assets on any chain, basically any chain that exists or even will exist. Because it's basically just this, like all we're supporting is the low level signing scheme. So as long as the MPC network is willing and able to sign using the signature scheme of the blockchain that you are trying to sign for, then you're able to construct this valid signature and ultimately then send a transaction on that chain. So now getting to the point about any questions there before I talk about atomicity.
Yeah, I guess like one question is that, when we think about these in terms of, a certain subset of the entire nodes in the network have to sign in order for it to be valid, like it sounds a lot like a multi-sig. I'm curious if there's like another way to think about it or look at it in terms of like the security, the economic security, or like the trust assumptions that are inherited, when we're looking at the nodes in the network. Is that like the right way to think about it, or is there some other security like metrics that are going on here that help to secure this MPC network?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, like there are multiple signatures. So I think like, yeah, you could look at this and be like, this is a multi-sig. I think the biggest difference is going to be like the way that you're sort of securing it. So I think it's like a good North Star of like, there are a few teams who are, I think, doing a pretty good job of this pattern. So like Threshold Network, with their TBTC product, they use pretty much this same pattern. The big thing that they have that's a part of this is like each of those potential signers has to be like staking some of this token, and then they basically rotate who's in the active set like over some kind of like defined epoch, and that adds like it makes it a little bit harder to kind of compromise the system. But like you could also probably fairly accurately turn that a multi-sig. So I wouldn't say that like this is like not a multi-sig in the sense that like you do have these multiple signatures coming from these like disparate parties. But what's going to make it secure is like, how do you choose who's in that set? How often are you able to rotate the set? Are there penalties or rewards? I mean, there's different views on slashing. Is like some slashing could be like you never get any future rewards. Some slashing could be like you have to stake something and then you lose that and you give up future rewards. A lot of that depends on like the system and what you're custodying. So I do think that is like the critical part of the security of the system. And then there's a not new, but I think in vogue primitive, which is the trusted execution environment, which potentially allows you to verify that the code, both the code and inputs that are being like run against the code, are valid and like signed by the hardware key of some type of hardware provider. So I think the best way to think about security of these systems is like you basically want to encompass multiple different elements. Ideally, you have some sort of permissionless way for people to join this network and to verify who's joining. Ideally, you have some type of economic stake, whether that's rewards, future rewards, actual stake that can be slashed, whatever it is. And then ideally you have, some type of cryptographic way to determine bad behavior, and then ideally even prevent bad behavior. And so for our system, our aim is to have basically all three of those elements encompassed. So our validators will be heavily incentivized to participate in a correct way. And the good thing is, like, what we do is every single request and every single response is on the near blockchain. So every single signature request should start on the near blockchain. Every single signature response will be returned to the near blockchain, which this gives us is like a perfect audit log of the behavior of the system. So one thing we would be able to do is, if, say, you are using this system to custody Bitcoin, and for whatever reason, critical majority of the operators are able to collude off-chain and basically sign to take your Bitcoin, well, you can actually prove using a light client that we have on Near for Bitcoin that a signature happened on Bitcoin from your account, and there was not a predating request for that signature, or even just a request at all, because that request comes from your private key. So like it can't even be forged at any time. And then you'd be able to, either sue, slash, do like any number of sort of ways to kind of like hold these counterparties responsible for that invalid signature. So the idea here is basically this defense in depth strategy, where we will encompass a lot of these different sort of components to try to make this as robust of a system as possible.
Covalent is solving the long-term data availability problem, where a lot of the data availability providers today in the modular space, when you post data to them, they actually only hold that data for about 12 to 16 days. And then it's basically, it can go into an archive node, or oftentimes it's just kind of put away into the abyss. And what Covalent's trying to do is build this long-term data availability solution, which can plug into some of these modular data availability providers and provide this longer-term perpetual data solution. So what we try to think of this as is when you post transaction data onto Celestia or Veil or any of these modular DA solutions, or even Ethereum, Covalent is able to provide a long-term data storage and data availability platform for that data after the time period. Blockchains are billboards, not databases, and we need these providers in the space to be able to kind of hold on to the long-term data that is provided from these providers and these blockchain state. This is where Covalent comes in. They just had a nice rebrand. Check them out on Twitter as well as the website. Thank you for being here. Hope you enjoy the rest of the show.
Yeah, and to your point, these economic security, not just economic, but these security systems are combined and aggregated, and so it's not like you can only, if you attack just one piece of the system, you get access to all of it. No, you have to kind of break. You mentioned like 3 plus social consensus if you sue. So kind of like 4 total systems. You have to break all of them in order to kind of like get access and manipulate the system against the rules. So it's an and security additive system rather than just an or system that you can only break one of them. I think that makes a lot of sense. And then you also started to mention how these signatures originate on the near blockchain and then they end up returning to the near blockchain. And so I think this will lead into atomicity and how these signatures kind of permeate through the rest of the chains. But kind of walk us through one life cycle, if you will, of a signature. It originates on near, what happens in the origination process, and then kind of where does it go? How do atomic transactions happen with this signature? And then ultimately it returns back to the near blockchain.
Yeah, great question. So basically the life cycle is signature is requested. So this smart contract on near is called with the request for the signature. MPC operators construct the signature. They each use their key shard to sign the signature, create a valid sort of complete signature for that master public key. Then they return it back to the near blockchain. So that'll usually happen within a few seconds because we basically allow for this kind of async await type of process on the near blockchain, where it's okay, request comes in, contract's basically waiting for a response is finally returned, it resolves. And so the user can then, or whoever it is, can basically receive that signature, construct a valid transaction for whatever chain they want to send it to, and then send it to either RPC or hit a validator or miner or whatever directly in order to get included in a block on that destination chain. So we can talk into like how that process will like play out in practice, but a lot of it depends on the use case.
Well,
as for how, or go for it.
No. I mean, I was going to ask about a particular use case because you gave me kind of like, if we're sending these requests or signatures directly to a miner or a builder, perhaps for inclusion, that's kind of like again, like an in vogue type of use case that I think is available now, or people are thinking about like, how do I ensure inclusion of my particular transaction, and maybe even like ensure execution of the order of this transaction. Maybe I want it at the top of the block, or sandwich or something like that. And so one of the use cases that I'm thinking about is like, is this something where we could almost use Near as like a pre-conf system, sending some inclusion for the inclusion of some other chain that gets originated and then validated on Near? Or is that use case kind of out of scope? What are some of the use cases that you're thinking about are most practical for this system?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd have to think more about and like read a bit more about like the current sort of proposed structure for pre-confirmations to see whether or not that's sort of valid. I think like the important thing is you still need to get this to the proposers. So like this system is designed to help sign something to then be like given to proposers, like sign a hash of a transaction that can then be included in like a complete transaction body and sent to proposers. So the use cases were mainly, I think, and getting kind of into that atomicity idea is like, so if you want to basically handle a trade between two different blockchains, ideally you want to have like the ability to land transactions on both those blockchains in a coordinated way, like whether it's synchronized, coordinated, whatever it is. So you want to know that the transactions are going to land on both of those chains. And that's what this system gives you, is like you can have one smart contract, in this case on Near, that can land transactions on 2 or 3 or 10 or however many chains. And it can land those transactions in whatever order. And so when we think about atomicity, like actually one of the ways that I think is the most radical of what a lot of our systems are designed for using this is like, you kind of can go away from thinking about trading like assets on a given chain, and you can start thinking about trading public keys. Because like I can basically give you the right to sign for my public key. And if I do that, you have control over all of the assets that are in that account. So a couple of the teams we have were using this system to build like a multi-chain DEX or multi-chain lending. The way they're actually thinking of it is they're thinking about, we're going to like use public keys as collateral for lending protocols. And we're going to use public keys as like the unit in which basically the one order. Like if you want to like trade something, you'll create a new public key, send assets to that public key, and that'll basically be your order. And then you'll offer to sell that whole public key to maybe me. And so like one way to do this that's, feels to users exactly like their experiences today is you'll only deposit Bitcoin into that public key. So it'll be like you're selling 1 Bitcoin. It'll basically be like that's a 1 Bitcoin order. And then I can come with maybe USDC on Solana, assuming that you're open to that. And I can deposit like, I don't know, let's say today, $50,000 worth of USDC on Solana and then we can agree to basically swap the right to use each other's public keys. And the cool thing is like when I talk about atomic is that part, like the control of the public key, because that's actually governed by, in this case, this Near system, that swap will happen on Near. And so we'll actually settle that transaction atomically, meaning that like you will always be able to sign for that account. I will always be able to sign for your account. Like that swap will happen atomically and on Near in about 1.2 seconds. And like one of the cool sort of downstream effects of this is like you can actually be trading atomically these assets on much slower chains at Near block time. Now, if you want to move those assets like to a different account, to cold storage, whatever, obviously you're gonna have to be bound by the block time of whatever wherever that asset is living. But at least that like control part will happen at the Near block time atomically. And so that same pattern can be recreated for a lot of different use cases. That actually is like, and it's cool because like it doesn't. One of the big challenges in building interoperable systems that as a lot of these amazing teams who have been taking on this great challenge we'll talk about is that blockchains have extremely different assumptions, right? They have different confirmation times. They have different finality times. They have different concepts of what finality even means, like between proof of work, proof of stake. Like finality doesn't even mean the same thing. And then they have different rules about like rollbacks, gas, all those kind of things. And so it's really, really complex to build systems between all these different chains. But by instead kind of moving things to this like sort of public key level and focusing on supporting signature schemes. And really there's two. that just about every blockchain uses, which is like ECDSA for EVM chains, most of Bitcoin, Cosmos chains, etc., and EDDSA for Near, Solana, Ton, and a few others. We get coverage of pretty much everything that's out there. So
I think it's really, really freaking cool. And I wanted to get into essentially like just kind of outlining how this is working. We have a Bitcoin order on the Bitcoin blockchain for 1 Bitcoin. And then we have someone paying for that Bitcoin on the Solana blockchain. And all of that is settled on Near. Did I get that
That's exactly right? That's exactly right. As wacky as that sounds.
Yeah. And so, like, if we're thinking about this from the end user perspective, are they interacting with the Near blockchain at all? Or is it just like the buyer is on Solana, the seller of the Bitcoin is on Bitcoin, and they don't have to touch the Near blockchain? It just kind of helps orchestrate this transfer behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's a good question. So our goal is that users will never necessarily need to explicitly interact with the Near blockchain as far as they are concerned. In the case where all they're looking to do is go from like chain A to chain B, and neither of those chains are Near. So there's a couple ways we can do this. Right now, there does need to be a Near transaction from both of these groups, basically like authorizing at least a signature. So I think only one of them will actually need to interact with Near, probably the taker. Like a maker can just sign a message, and that can be like, we can verify that came from them on the Near blockchain. But someone will have to kind of like settle that and like send that to the Near smart contract. So there's a couple ways that can be handled. Right now, we're basically working on a really cool abstraction pattern that will let you use like message signing on any chain to effectively send a transaction on Near. Like you'll basically be signing kind of like order details. And then you'll be able to like send that signed message on Near, and like using some other kind of account abstraction features that we have that are native to Near, you'll be able to control a Near account and effectively send that transaction. Because the vision for the user experience here is like, okay, you add the minimum number of like new wallets or new context to the user journey. So if you're going from Bitcoin to Solana, ideally you should be able to do that all in one wallet. Like regardless of what your wallet is built to custody, ideally like you start in one wallet, you end in one wallet. You move from Bitcoin to Solana, great. There are some ways we can enable that. I think the downside is like ultimately the wallet providers have to be the ones who are going to be showing balances in the wallet. So like if you want that part of the user experience consistent, then like you have to use the wallet that supports the chains that you want to interact with. Yeah, I mean, another way we can do it too is like we have a lot of teams building specifically Bitcoin applications. And so the UX for them, it's very clear what it has to be. You only use your existing Bitcoin wallet. You never have to directly acquire Near. You never have to directly interact with the Near blockchain, even if in the background Near is enabling the experience pattern that you have. So it's very use case specific, but I would say that like the teams that we're going to be launching over the next few weeks and months, you'll see that they are actually preserving this sort of like UX kind of we see as like a hard line of users do not need to get new wallets in order to interact with the system. They only have to use the wallets they're starting with.
A couple questions that are related. Like, how much impact does this have on existing wallets? And then second question is, how much impact does this have on like the base level networks? Is this going to require, in our case of Bitcoin to Solana and back, like, is that going to require any changes to the Bitcoin network, any changes to the Solana network? Or can they kind of like continue to operate like as they are operating without any changes needed, new opcodes, any changes to the underlying base layer?
Yeah, great question. So fortunately, the answer is a hard no. They do not need to make any changes. And it actually even goes a little bit of a step further. I mean, again, assuming that you have faith in the system and like that's our top challenge and our top focus, then you basically get account abstraction functionality for any chain as an EOA on that chain, right? So like even for Ethereum, again, one of the challenges people are trying to solve with like the 4337 wallet pattern is that you actually have to, you're basically having like one smart contract and one account for each chain or L2 even that you are interacting with. And if you want to make an update to like whatever the keys that are able to sign for that account or some permissions or whatever it is, you have to send transactions to every single one of those accounts on those different chains and L2s. For this, you don't. You actually just have the Near accounts, or the near smart contract, and then you have EOAs on whatever other chain you want to interact with. And so you can, like, we have all that account abstraction functionality natively on near anyway. And so you can just make changes to the near account, and then it's like, it doesn't even propagate, but it's as though to the user, it's like propagated to every single one of those accounts. So for that example I just described of like trading from Bitcoin to Solana, as far as Bitcoin and Solana are concerned, it was just a normal trend, like actually nothing even happened in the base case, right? Like step one is you have to deposit to those accounts on those two chains for each of those respective users. But after that, actually nothing has happened. Like if we just did the sort of atomic swap where like I now have control of your Bitcoin account, you have control of my Solana account, those chains, like there wasn't even a transaction that landed there. Now, if we want to withdraw to our respective, like, cold storage, like wallets, whatever it is, then a transaction will land on those chains, but it'll just look like a normal transaction. It'll just be like, oh, all right, they transferred, this Bitcoin to this account, they transferred this USDC on Solana to this account, and that's that.
And when you say that, like, the buyer of my keys kind of like takes custody of that, I think I know the answer, but I just want to hear like a little bit more about it. It's like, if I have other money or other assets in that particular EOA key, it's not like they're going to take like custody of all of the assets. It's only what I put into this particular smart contract.
Yeah, great point. So generally, I mean, there are teams using this to build wallets, and in that case, like you probably don't want to just sell your whole account, but you can. I mean, there will actually be like a new thing you can do with this is you can actually sell your whole account. If you're just like, I'm out of crypto, like I'll liquidate, take the whole thing, give me a price. That will be possible. But generally, like the dexes we have building this now, what they're doing is like they create an entirely basically new account, like a new public key for every single order. So for the user, they're like, hey, deposit into they'll usually be like, deposit to this order, like deposit to this account for specifically this order, and then you'll sell it. They also will enable you to, and depending on which assets you're trading, like you could deposit to like a master account that they control, and then they'll handle the like creating a new order for you when you just click like create new order. And so you won't actually explicitly, necessarily like transfer those funds yourself. But yeah, it kind of depends on the use case. But yeah, generally you should only put into this system what you want to trade immediately, which also helps with the security principles, right? Because it's like, then you only have that money, custody by the system for that discrete period of time where you want to do the swap, and then you have it in your like crazy like multiple ledgers off chain buried in your backyard type of setup for the rest of the time.
It's incredible. This account key, public key, gets created, it gets funded, it gets or that might depend on the block time, but essentially this brand new account is created and traded to a new owner in the block time of near, which you said is like 1.2 seconds.
Yep. There's a little bit of extra latency for the signature. It'll probably be like 3 to 4 seconds, but it's pretty quick, and we believe we can get that down much further over time.
Very, very cool. What other like use cases? You mentioned kind of like the trading DeFi use case, the liquidating the entire account, the rage quit button, if you will. Like, what other use cases do you anticipate this scale opens up, and this composability opens up for some of these multi-chain use cases?
Everclear is pioneering the clearing layer. The clearing layer can almost be thought of as Splitwise when you go on a trip with friends, but for the blockchain. What I mean by that is when users are sending cross-chain messages, there's oftentimes fillers and solvers who have balances left on different chains that they need to rebalance and reset their positions. This is where Everclear comes in. Everclear is pioneering a collaborative approach to the chain abstraction future, and they are willing to work with interoperability partners, solvers, and other providers in the space to build a interoperable and chain abstraction future. Check out Everclear at everclear.org, and welcome back to the roll-up.
Cartesia is your home for app-specific rollups. At the forefront of developing new tools and platforms that enhance the capabilities of blockchain technology, Cartesia enables applications that are flexible and built to scale. Build on a full Linux environment and use traditional software libraries, but in blockchain development. Go to cartesia.io, that's cartesia.io, to learn more about building your own app chain today.
Yeah, so there's a couple of like main categories that we're seeing teams build with. So one is like DeFi on non-smart contract chains. So we have a lot of teams building things on Bitcoin. And what's cool is that, while it is not just using the Bitcoin layer one for security, the benefit is that you can add a lot of functionality without making any changes to Bitcoin. So in that way, it actually preserves some of like the hardcore, like maxi ideals of like, even L2s shouldn't happen on Bitcoin. I mean, I think they should, but that's a separate opinion. So like you can basically use this system as like your smart contract layer for Bitcoin, for Dogecoin, for Litecoin, even for things like, BitTensor, like newer kind of like non-smart contract chains. So that we see a lot of teams building in that area, particularly in Bitcoin, although some are experimenting with like BitTensor and others as well. Second category is kind of what we call like any chain DeFi or OmniFi. I don't know. They're still figuring out the name on it, but the idea is building chain agnostic applications where like as an application developer, you might say, hey, my goal is just to get as many users as possible. I don't actually care which chain. I want to serve any chain where there's demand. And teams that particularly fit into this bucket is a team like an Oracle, right? Like Oracle's, like their product is verified prices. If you look at most of the Oracle teams, like they try to support as many chains as they can, but obviously it's a lot of work for them to add new support, especially as like we're now in this great virtual machine renaissance where there's a lot of new VMs, and like that's what adds most of the overhead for them. What's cool about this system is that if they bring their price feed, the verified price feed onto Near, they can then use chain signatures to sign it using like a key only their account can sign from, which can then be used on like basically any chain that has kind of like private key verification functionality, which is pretty much everyone I've ever seen, because that's such like a core kind of building block for developers. So and like that's like the Oracle case to do this. And then we have teams like in the DEXs and particularly DEXs and lending space where they're like, yeah, we also want to be able to support trading between any assets on any chain or using any asset as collateral on any chain, even chains that don't exist yet. Like the second a chain is live, we want people to be able to interact with our system with like minimal extra integration work. And because of the like flexibility of the chain signatures, like how low level it is, we can now enable that. We can enable teams to just like build a product, and then anyone on any chain can kind of come to it, maybe even do the integration themselves if it's like easy enough. And it doesn't require changes from the core developer team to their system on Near. But they still support all these chains. So like any chain DeFi, any chain applications is like another area. And then the final one that we see in a lot of teams build with is the like multi-chain account abstraction. So we have a lot of teams using this for basically wallet support, right? Like if they want to add support for new chains, or even I think one of the cool areas is like passkey-based wallets. A lot of teams like Infinex and others are doing really great work there. And I think there's a lot of benefits to that. Certain chains don't actually have support for that signature scheme. And so you need either smart contracts like on Ethereum and like the 4337 pattern, or for something like Bitcoin, you're kind of like out of luck without chain signatures. So we have a couple of teams who are, basically building passkey-based wallets for Bitcoin, Litecoin, these type of networks. They're able to use like these, this pattern on Near, so that you can get kind of that full functionality. So there's a few others too, like in the privacy realm and some crazy like contract deployment strategies. But those three categories are the major ones.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, from the current landscape of things, people want to do things multi-chain. Not only because it'll enable certain use cases now, like a lot of those being DeFi use cases, but also because it'll simplify the on-ramp experience for a lot of these people to get involved and use blockchain applications. They don't have to onboard into a particular ecosystem and then get kind of like vendor locked on, any given L1. They can kind of just onboard into the app that they want to use. A really great example of this was, something like Polymarket, right? Is kind of having that breakaway distribution now where they're able to get into some conversations, call them normie circles, right? And I saw it wasn't Polymarket affiliated, but it was an integration that someone had with the Ton blockchain. I think this was Skate, which is doing like some stateless apps. And so they were able to do, and so basically like all of these different blockchains now have different advantages for their particular ecosystem or their app. Ton has a ton of distribution on Telegram, right? Not to be confused with Tron, which also has a ton of distribution, but for another reason. And so basically like Skate was able to do this integration where you could bet on Polymarket markets directly from Telegram. And I think, that is kind of the best of both worlds, where anyone who's on Telegram doesn't really even need to know or care that they're interacting with blockchain. Maybe they do if they have a Ton wallet, but they're basically able to just interact with a market that they want to trade directly from the user interface that they're familiar with using. And so, all of that blockchain is abstracted away from the end user. I tend to think, we're going to start to see some of these blockchains get used for their use cases and their advantages that they have. Tron being geographically located with some stablecoin usage. Ton has distribution through Telegram. All of these different L1s kind of have their own like playing field that they've been able to master. And now it seems like we're getting the interoperability standards and tooling that is going to allow these L1s to interact with one another and get the advantages brought out. And all of these L1s are going to kind of be able to combine forces for a better end user experience. Some of them more user facing, some of them more like, it sounds like Near is going to be kind of like this engine like underneath the hood that's going to be able to power a lot of the applications that may happen on Bitcoin or happen on Solana or happen on Ton, may end up using Near behind the scenes.
Yeah, that vision is exactly what we're really excited about too. I think in the example you gave with like the Ton and Poly Market powered by Skate right now is kind of the case, right? It's like, so what we want to enable, I think even more so from like the developer side, is like for the future Poly Markets. Yeah, there is great distribution on Ton, and like that, I think that happened like well after Poly Market was launched, right? Like they've been live for years. And so for them to tap into that now, it's like does require a bit of work, or some of these things like Skate, right? And we kind of want to like, for the next wave of developers, we want to like prevent that, right? Where you can prepare for a world where different blockchains have different strengths and different user bases, different target like cultures, everything, right? Like there is just that kind of specialization happening. And you can prepare for that in a really defensible way, because like you're building on top of a low level signature scheme, which means you're going to have the broadest base support possible when it comes to new chains. The only thing that will limit you from integrating new chains will be, do we support the signature scheme? And the good news is that, I mean, it sort of depends. Like there'll probably be some crazy new signatures that are designed. It'll take us some time to get like NPC, protocols for them. But generally, everybody's using two signature schemes. And so once we support those two signature schemes, you're very well covered. And so, yeah, the vision I think is like, write your contract right now on Near. And like, I mean, we could potentially, the network could listen to other chains too, if that made sense for, for our users. But it's like, write your contract on Near and you can actually just serve every single chain. And build these patterns where like your users just, if they're on time, like we have a very popular Telegram wallet right now for Near, but they're using this tech to expand to Ton and to other networks called Hot. And like their users have been very excited because like they were just doing things in the Near ecosystem, and now they do things on Base. They had like some of the highest user numbers on Base because they just like all of a sudden could do partnerships with Base teams and like let their users use Base apps. And now they're expanding to like Ton and BNB and these kind of things. And like, so you can now like as a developer have that kind of confidence that you're going to be able to access users wherever they are, or bring users to you, whatever makes sense for your application, without having to like do all this crazy integration work, or like think about like how insane a migration would look like if Poly Market wanted to move now. Like it's going to be a pretty big effort for them, right? And I think that's where they're going to have to tap into some other systems in order to kind of make that happen.
Yeah, Poly Market's still on Polygon proof of stake.
Yep.
It's like kind of funny. They're still there, and probably because it's a lot of overhead for them to migrate at this point, if they would even migrate. But it seems like there is kind of a like rationale to do so. Kendall, this has been super informative. I definitely learned a lot. I think our audience has as well. I'm a math nerd, and so like whenever you get talking about cryptography, I'm always like, I want to learn more and more about that. I think we went like pretty deep on a lot of the more practical side of things, and so maybe we'll just use this like these last few minutes as like appendix or like bonus track, if you will. But like you mentioned the two cryptography schemes, I'm always like super stoked to like learn more about that, and I'm just curious, like as kind of a beginner in that space for myself and our audience, like looking to learn more. Could you kind of give us a 101 on like, how those different cryptographic schemes work, what they are, and like, if we were to kind of like be curious to learn more, where would we go, and what would be the best path to kind of go down that rabbit hole?
Yeah, great question. So I just full disclosure, I am not the cryptographer on the team or even like anywhere close to the CTO of this effort. That's this guy, David, who I'm sure you'll be hanging more for him, who can really dive into the details. And we have a technical deep dive that will show like a formal model of like the MPC scheme, KiteSith, and how it works coming out in like the next week or so. So I'll be sure to send that way for your readers, just to kind of talk about like the higher level and how you would learn more though. So basically there are several different signature schemes that like public private key signature schemes that are out there that are, you know, reasonably heavily used. Within blockchains, there's, I guess, like three, but one is like a derivative of some of the others. So like the one that's originally was used by Bitcoin, it was used by Ethereum, is used by Cosmos chains and quite a few others, is ECDSA. And apparently it's like actually like an even slightly more complex version of another signature scheme that's existed for a long time, which is EDDSA, and a specific version of that is the ED25519, which is the one that's used by Solana, Ton, Near, and a lot of popular blockchains today. And yeah, I mean, the only other signature scheme that's like pretty popular that I'm aware of is like Schnorr signatures, which is effectively like EDDSA is a type of Schnorr signature. So you're kind of like, if you learn how Schnorr signatures work, you can like, it might be like a slightly different sort of like algorithm for like how you could construct like an EDDSA signature or like specifically the ED25519. I recommend reading any material that's out there on Schnorr signatures if you're trying to get an understanding of like how a lot of the newer blockchains handle their signature schemes. For ECDSA, there's some great papers and even some great kind of like MPC scheme papers that are out there. I know like Dfinity was actually one of the earlier teams. Of this guy, Growth, who's like a really amazing cryptographer who used to be there, who has a really great paper that goes through kind of like a pretty performant version of an ECDSA MPC like threshold signing scheme. So that paper is definitely a good one to read. And then like the one that we're using particularly is called KiteSith. So Lit Protocol, like they also use KiteSith. They have some good material out there that explains like how their signature scheme works. And then we'll be releasing that deep dive on our side pretty soon too. We like made some changes to the way that it works. There was more specific to our use case, which I think will probably be interesting for some of the readers out there who really want to dive into the cryptography. Unfortunately, not as much my exact field of specialty. So can't go too deep for the other math nerds who are listening in because that's less me.
No worries. It's tough. It's like, you know, I try to find every ounce of gigabrain that's out there. You certainly provided quite a bit, so I really appreciate you stretching to the limits and give us a run through of chain signatures. I think that's a very, very cool primitive for the multi-chain world that is going to really help in terms of chain abstraction. A bunch of teams that are building now. So Kendall, thank you so much for coming on, man. It was an absolute blast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, it was super fun.
Awesome. Where can people find you? Where can people learn more? And just any closing thoughts that you have, feel free to share.
Yeah, Twitter is probably the best place. Maybe you guys can kind of share that in the tweet storm. But yeah, that's where I spend most of my time. Also on Telegram. Pretty much those are the two places. As far as closing thoughts, I'd say keep an eye out. We've got some pretty exciting announcements in the next week or so. We're retaining to this. We're getting very, very close to mainnet, so super excited about that.
Awesome. Yeah, sounds good. We'll definitely have you tagged in the tweet so you can everyone can go hop over to your account, give Kendall a follow, and stay tuned, learn more. And yeah, good luck, have fun on the path to mainnet. Cheers.
Thanks.